What's up, guys? Paul from the Sysadmin channel, bringing you the best tips and tools for your sysadmin journey. In our last video, we covered everything to run PHP on a Windows 2019 server running IIS. And in this video, we're going to install the local copy of Microsoft SQL Express. We're going to create a table needed for our new hire onboarding web application. And we'll even go over some configs needed to bring it all back full circle. This is the second video in the building a web application with PowerShell and PHP series. So be sure to check out our first video if you haven't seen it already. All right, let's get started. So I'm going to open up Windows Explorer, and if you notice, I have 5 local drives set up. I've got the OS drive, I've got the E drive, which is where the web application tool is installed. I've got a SQL data drive, and I've got a SQL log drive, as well as the SQL temp DB drive. So when it comes to SQL, it's always good practice to have separate drives for your MDF, your LDF, and your temp DB files. So this is what I've done here. All right, so now let's move on to installing SQL Server 2019 Express. This is the free version, so it's relatively light. So this is a good choice for our use case. Another thing to note is that since our web application is going to be integrated with PowerShell, I wanted to keep it in the Microsoft ecosystem. So that's why I chose Microsoft SQL and not MySQL or any other SQL flavor for that matter. Plus, if you already have a dedicated Microsoft SQL Server running in your environment, you can go ahead and use that and easily integrate it with this project. So as you can see, we've already downloaded the install for SQL Server 2019 Express. And here I'm going to install it under the E drive. So once I select that, we can go ahead and click install. This is going to take a little bit, so I'm going to fast forward this whole portion and then move on once it's done. All right, it looks like it just finished and it automatically opened up the SQL Server Installation Center. And since our goal is to install SQL, I'm going to select the first option to install a new SQL standalone installation. I'm going to accept the terms and then click next. Next up, I'm going to check the checkbox to install the recommended updates, and then we'll go ahead and let that load. Keep in mind here that there is a warning for the Windows firewall. We'll get to that later, but for now, we'll go ahead and click on next to continue. And here we're prompted with the instance features of what we want to install. I'm going to unselect everything for the moment and only leave the database engine services. So we'll go ahead and check that. And then if we scroll down a little bit, we can see the shared features. I'm going to install the top 4 just like so. And we're not going to touch the root instance directory or the shared features directory, so we can move on and click next. All right, next up, we are given the option to name our instance and our instance ID. So in my case, I'm going to set the instance to WebTools since that gives us a pretty clear understanding on what it's used for. So once we have that set, we'll go ahead and click next to move on. And here is where we'll need to specify the service accounts for our configuration. Prior to the video, I created a svc-webtooldb account specifically for this, so we'll go ahead and use that. I'll go ahead and type that in and check name to resolve. And then once that is done, we'll go ahead and put in our lab password that we set. So that looks good. We'll go ahead and click on the collation tab just to make sure that everything is set properly, and it is. So we'll go ahead and click next from here. Next up is where we'll need to add administrator rights to our SQL instance. Instead of granting individual rights to a user account, I'm going to grant admin rights to the group. That way we can just simply add and remove users from the group. So I'll go ahead and add that there. We'll go ahead and click on data directories. Nothing to change there, but in our tempdb, here's where we actually will make some changes. So if you recall earlier in the video, I created separate drives for the database and the tempdb files. So here's where that comes into play. First off, I'm going to set the auto growth to 256 megs. And I don't want to use the default installation location for our tempdb data directory. So I'll go ahead and remove that. So next up, I'm going to create a database directory under our H drive. And then we'll use that as the new directory for our tempdb. All right, so we'll go ahead and select that H drive in the dropdown, select database, and that about wraps it up for the tempdb location for the tempdb tab. So next up, we'll go ahead and move on to the memory just to see what's next. So I'll go ahead and click on that. And here on the memory tab, I'm going to select the recommended option with some adjustments. Since I only have 4 gigs set up on the server, I'm going to set the minimum server memory to 512 megs. And for the max, I'm going to use 75% of the total memory server. So in my case, it's going to be 3072 megs or 3 gigs. With that said, I'm going to check the box to accept the recommended configurations. And here in the user instances, I don't have anything to check there. And the file stream, I don't have anything to check there as well. All right, so let's go ahead and click next to continue on with the installation. I'm going to fast forward this just a little bit. And once that is done, we can see that everything has been installed successfully. If I go ahead and scroll down just a little bit, we can see that the other features are installed. All right, so next up on the list, once that is done, is to install SQL Server Management Tools. So we can see here that that is on the SQL Server Installation Center. So we'll go ahead and click on that to launch the web page. And here we'll just click on the link to download SQL Server Management Studio. Once that is done, it should automatically pop up for the install. For the location, I'm going to set it as the default location under the program files, and later when we create our database, so that's where we'll set it to use the drives that we set up earlier in the video. All right, once that is done, we can go ahead and close this Internet Explorer page. We can also close this SQL Server Installation Center. So let's go ahead and do that now. We can go ahead and close our Chrome browser. So let's go ahead and do that as well. All right, next up is configuring the SQL Server Configuration Manager. So let's go ahead and launch that from the Start menu. And once we have that open, we'll want to confirm that our WebTool DB service account is being used to start the service. We can see that that is enabled and set there. There's really nothing needed to configure here in the SQL native client. However, if we expand the SQL Server network configuration, we'll need to set up some options there. First off, we'll need to enable TCP IP, and we'll also need to enable name pipes. This will allow us to use PowerShell and connect to our SQL database. Next up, we'll need to set up our ports, our TCP ports. So we'll go ahead and enter in that now. The default port for SQL is 1433. So we'll make sure that that gets set on all of the TCP ports here. And if we expand the SQL native client 11 configuration, we'll just want to make sure that the default port is set to 1433 as well. All right, so once that is set, the next thing we're going to do is to allow remote machines the ability to connect to the SQL instance. So to do that, we'll need to open port 1433 inbound on this machine. I'm going to be doing some testing and connecting from my laptop, but once it's all said and done, we'll want to make sure that we close off this port. That way we don't leave any security holes in our web application. All right, so now that we have our firewall open, I'm going to allow port 1433 only. So we'll go ahead and set that and click next. We're going to allow the connection for the time being, and we're going to unselect private and public. That way we only allow domain machines. We're going to name this SQL inbound. That way we know what it is, and then click finish. All right, so now we have a hole punched in our firewall to allow remote machines to connect to our SQL server. And that pretty much completes our setup. So I'm going to reboot the server to make sure all of our changes and configs are set. So with our server freshly rebooted, let's move on to setting up the database and the tables. To do that, I'm going to open up SQL Server Management Studio from our Start menu and wait till that loads up. If you recall, I added Windows authentication, so I'm allowed to log in under my own user account. So I'll go ahead and click connect here. We can also confirm that the security group that we added earlier is part of the admins group. So if we go ahead and expand logins here, we can see that my name and the WebTool administrators is set as a login as well. All right, moving on, let's go ahead and right click database and select new database. Here we're going to want to, well, first of all, let's go ahead and expand it. But for our database name, let's go ahead and set it to WebTool, since we're going to be using WebTool for everything. For our initial size here, we're going to set this to 128 megs, and our auto growth is going to be set to 128 as well. We'll go ahead and click OK to there, and then we'll set the WebTool log to the same thing. We'll go ahead and set that to 128 megs. And for the auto growth size, we'll go ahead and set that to 128 as well. All right, so for the path, here is where we'll want to set our dedicated SQL drive. So we'll grab our path for our MDF or our SQL database file. So in our case, it's going to be the F drive database. So go ahead and clear the default path that's under there, under our web tool. And then we'll enter in our F database path. We're going to want to do the same thing for our G drive or our SQL log file. So we'll grab that path there. And then once again, we'll replace the default and then put in the our location for our G drive. All right, so once that is set, the next thing we're going to do is click on options here. And we don't really have anything to set here, so we'll go ahead and move on. I'll go ahead and click on file groups, and there's nothing really to set there either. But if we look here on File Explorer, we can see that our log file has been created with 128 megs. If we go to our F drive, we can see that the database file has been created as well. All right, next up on the list is actually creating the table needed for our new hire application, our new hire web application. So to do that, we'll right click on table and we'll select a new table. And here on the right-hand pane is where we can set up our columns that are needed. We're going to be setting up 11 columns in total, starting off with our ID column. This column is going to be our primary key and have it auto incremented. But first, let's get the rest of our columns set up. So we're going to set this as an integer since it's an ID field. Next up, we're going to set the first name, and we're going to set it as a varchar, and we'll set it to 50 characters max. The next one is last name. We'll set that one to varchar as well. After that is going to be the full name. We'll leave that as varchar. And then the username, we'll set that to varchar as well. Next up is the email address. So we can have an email set up when we create our user account. And then we'll set that as varchar 50 as well. After that is going to be the employee ID, and we're going to want to set that up as a varchar. The manager's email, because once we create the accounts, we're going to want to send an email to their manager. Next up is the initiated by, and this is going to be the setting that of the person that's running the setup. The date is going to be a small date time format, and finally the processed field. This will tell us if the account has been processed or not. All right, so I am going to uncheck allow nulls because we don't want any nulls in our database. So if we find a null, it'll automatically spit out an error. All right, and as I mentioned, the ID field is going to be set as the primary key. This is going to be auto incremented as well. So we'll go ahead and expand this field on the bottom and then expand identity specification and is identity, and we'll go ahead and set that to yes. It is going to be auto incremented once that setting is set to yes, and we'll go ahead and save it. And since this is going to be our new hire table, we're going to name that appropriately. So once we have that text typed in, we'll go ahead and click OK. And if we look here on the tables on the left-hand pane, we'll go ahead and refresh it so our tables can show up. One thing to note here too is if you need to make changes to the tables, there's an option that allows us to do that without getting an error. So we'll go ahead and go to Tools, Options, and then we'll scroll down to, Designers, and then Table and Database Designers. And then we'll want to uncheck the option to prevent saving changes. This will allow you to make a modification to the table without having to drop the table and recreate it. And once we confirm that everything is set up correctly and we don't need to make any changes to the tables, we'll go back and revert this setting to make sure that there aren't any unexpected changes to our setup. All right, so I'll click OK here. And for now, for our first entry in our database, I'm actually going to enter everything in manually just to make sure that we can get some kind of output on a basic query. We haven't created our PowerShell scripts to do this for us just yet. So I wanted to make sure I set up something that way when I query it, I can get something back. So to start off, for the ID, I'm going to set it as 1. This will be our very first entry. For the first name, I'll set it to Paul. Last name, Contreras. Full name would be first name and last name. The username would be pcontreras. The email address would be pcontreras@thesysadminchannel.com. I'm actually going to copy this too, because the sysadminchannel.com is pretty long, and I don't feel like typing that in every single time. For the employee ID, I'm going to set it to E182. The manager email, I'm going to set it to wifey@thesysadminchannel.com. For the initiated by, I'm going to set it to me@thesysadminchannel.com. And for the date, I'm just going to set it to 2020 11/11 at 11:11 o'clock. And finally, the process field is a bit data type, so it only allows 1 for true and 0 for false. Since I have my account already pre-created, I'm going to set it as 1 so it doesn't try to recreate it in the future. And the very last thing on our list for this video is to make sure that we can query our database using PowerShell. In our future videos, we'll actually be automating this entire process using PowerShell, so we'll have to make sure that we can talk to the database first. Also, since we have SQL Server Management Studio installed on this server, we should already have the SQL Server PowerShell module installed as well. This module is a requirement because it has the invoke-sqlcmd commandlet, which we'll be using for just about everything. Okay, so with PowerShell now open, we're going to set up our connection hash table to use with invoke-sqlcmd. We'll need the database server, the database name, and the database table in our hash table. So we'll start off by setting our con variable and the @ with the opening and closing curly braces. And as I mentioned, we're going to be setting the server in quotes to localhost, since that's the machine that has SQL installed. We'll want to close that off with a semicolon. After that, we'll use the database key and we'll set that value to webtool, since that is going to be the database that we're using. And finally, we're going to set our table key to the value of new hire. So we want to make sure that we set up that as well. And we want to make sure that everything is in quotes and has a semicolon in between. So once that is set, our con variable, our con hash table is now set up. And to query a SQL database in PowerShell, we'll use the command invoke-sqlcmd. We'll specify the server instance parameter to use the server key in our con hash table. Next, we'll specify the database parameter to use the database key. And for our query, we'll do a simple select star from our table key. And we also need to make sure that we use a sub-expression to expand the value. All right, and once we hit enter, we can confirm that we're successfully talking to our SQL database using PowerShell. In our next video, we'll set up the framework for PHP to make sure that we have a web page with a header, a body, and a footer, and the ability to access that web page from other machines on the network. All right, folks, this is Paul with the Sysadmin Channel, signing out.